She never really fit the stereotype of a typical mother. While most parents check their children's schoolwork and ensure that they are keeping up in school, my mother's primary focus was always herself. She was preoccupied with her looks and wanted me to always be skinny and put together, as if I were a reflection of her image rather than an individual with my own needs. Following the divorce, both of my parents were granted shared custody, and my time was divided between them. It took me some time to adjust to living in two different families, and just as I was becoming settled, my mother met Kevin. She was smitten from their first date. They began dating officially within days, and after only a few weeks, my mother forced me to meet with him. Suddenly, this complete stranger was everywhere, and I was expected to warmly welcome him into our lives. Now, if Kevin were a great person, I wouldn't have had any problems embracing him, but he isn't. Kevin had excessive expectations from the beginning. He expected I would gladly embrace him as my new father, despite the fact that he was a complete downgrade from my biological father. He continually meddles in my life and appears to take every opportunity to mock me. Regardless of what I do, he finds a way to criticize or control me. For example, he has 2 sons, and he becomes visibly irritated anytime he believes I'm acting too girly, as he likes to put it. He has explicitly stated that I should not wear dresses or tight skirts, as if how I dress is any of his business. He also insists that I never let my hair down and that I always wear my long hair in a bun. It does not stop there. When I have friends around, he always interrupts us, claiming he's just checking in. But it's not just a brief hello or a casual query. He barges in and hovers around, as if he doesn't trust me and my friends to be alone. It's really obtrusive and, frankly, humiliating. When I complain or urge him to leave us alone, he dismisses it, stating things like, "Girls require constant supervision," and that we should just pretend he isn't even around. It's irritating that he doesn't interfere as much with his sons or feel the need to constantly monitor their movements. When I've tried to express how much this worries me to my mother, hoping for support or at least some understanding, she just dismisses it. She claims he's just being protective, as if it excuses his actions. On top of everything, Kevin's 2 sons make my life even more difficult. They have no idea of personal space, and their personalities contradict mine in every aspect. They are also relentless when it comes to bullying me. They continuously tease, mock, and find new ways to make me feel small. And instead of intervening, my mother dismisses their behavior, stating, "That's how all siblings bond." When my mother decided to marry Kevin after only a year of dating, she expected me to simply fall in line. She made it clear that she loved Kevin and was determined to make their marriage work. She knew I had reservations and frustrations, but she was clear about what she expected from me. To give Kevin a chance without making things difficult for her. She begged me to welcome him as a member of our family. It seemed like a lot to ask, especially considering how quickly everything was occurring. But I wanted to assist her while keeping the peace, so I agreed to try. Since then, I have made a genuine attempt to accept Kevin and his sons. I've tried to follow his routines and adapt to the changes, though it hasn't been easy. One of the things that upsets me the most is Kevin's insistence that I refer to him as Dad. It doesn't feel right, and every time I say it, I can't help but feel animosity rise within me. I already have a father, and I do not want to replace him. However, Kevin does not seem to realize or care that it is difficult for me. Beyond the name, what is truly upsetting is my mother's shift in focus and goals. After her marriage, she seemed to be more concerned with Kevin's sons than with me. She spends more time with them, assists them in ways she never did for me, and treats them more like a mother than she ever did for me. I sometimes feel as though I've lost my place in her life. She is simply a mother to Kevin's sons now. I'd want to live with my father, especially because he's normally more understanding. However, he had to relocate for a new job in another city, which paid him substantially more. He pays me occasional visits, but I live with my mother full-time. Dad and I also communicate on the phone frequently. He is aware of some of my concerns with Kevin and his son since I have discussed them with him. He's really supportive and has even attempted to talk to my mother about the matter. I believe he sincerely wants to assist, but whenever he brings it up, my mother shuts him off. She tells him to back off and says he shouldn't meddle with her marriage. Despite everything, I've worked hard over the years to acclimate to life with my new family. I've really tried to make an effort with Kevin and his sons, believing that if I remained patient and transparent, we could develop a nice relationship. Despite my best attempts, I continue to feel invisible within my own family. This year, Kevin was suddenly promoted at work. When he got home, he excitedly declared that he'd be taking us all on a family trip. We were all excited by the news, especially since we hadn't been on a vacation together in a long time. He and Mom chose the location and reserved tickets and lodgings for all of us. Unfortunately, just a day before our trip, I was involved in a car accident with my mother. We were heading home from shopping for some clothing for our impending vacation when another automobile smashed into us from behind. It wasn't a major collision, but it was enough to throw us off course and cause some injuries. My mother was generally fine, with a few scrapes and bruises here and there, but I wasn't that fortunate. The accident caused me to break my arm and suffer a concussion. The ambulance arrived, and I was quickly brought to the hospital. When Kevin initially learned of our accident, he rushed to the hospital, appearing concerned. At first, I assumed he was really concerned for my and my mother's well-being, and that he had come to see us. But then he kept bringing up the trip, agonizing about whether we'd still be able to travel and worried that the money he'd invested would be wasted. The physicians eventually advised us that, due to my concussion, I would need to spend a few days in the hospital for observation. They wanted to make sure I was okay before allowing me to return home, but travel was obviously out of the question for me. Kevin glanced at me, irritated, as if I was to blame for getting into the accident and wasting his money. My mother half-heartedly offered to remain with me while I was in the hospital. It gave me hope that she would choose to help me during such a tough moment. Kevin, on the other hand, was quick to respond, stating that because our plane tickets had already been purchased, we were already losing money by not going. He argued that my mother should not waste even more money by staying behind. He then turned to me and said that at my age, I should be able to stay in the hospital alone for a few days. He mentioned how safe the hospital was, with physicians and nurses available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, hinting that I had nothing to worry about. Kevin then insisted that once I was discharged, he would arrange for a babysitter to stay with me at home. I argued with Kevin that I didn't want to be alone in the hospital or have a babysitter look after me at home. I urged my mother to stay with me instead. At first, my mother tried to defend me, telling Kevin that it wasn't proper to leave me alone in the hospital. She knew it was wrong. Kevin, however, continued to push back. He insisted that my mother's presence was unneeded and that her staying would mean sitting by my side doing nothing meaningful all day. He made it appear as if her presence was pointless, entirely neglecting the emotional support she could truly offer. Kevin prioritized avoiding spending his vacation money over anything else. It was evident that he didn't consider me to be his biological child, thus he didn't care how I felt or what had happened to me. I pleaded that at 15 years old, I shouldn't be left alone in the hospital. I was terrified and in agony, and the prospect of going through this without any family members around was overwhelming. I proposed a solution, stating that Mom could contact my father to come and stay with me while she and Kevin went on their trip. Sure, it would take him some time to get here because he lived in another city, but I was confident he'd come right away if he realized I was in the hospital. I figured this would allow them to continue their vacation while keeping me company. But Kevin rejected the notion almost immediately. He ignored my concerns, calling me foolish for making such a huge deal about small injuries. He dismissed my notion of calling my father, arguing that it would just make him worry more. Kevin felt there was no need to interrupt anybody else's plans over something as minor as a concussion and a fractured arm, which he believed would mend well with a few days of hospital rest. In the end, Kevin's pressure was effective. I stared at my mother, hoping she would hold her ground and insist on staying with me. But, as usual, she caved to Kevin. Instead of battling for what I needed, she decided to go. She only stayed with me for one night, which provided some consolation. I clung to the hope that, after seeing how vulnerable I was, she would realize I needed her presence. But the next day, Kevin arrived at the hospital to bring her up, anxious to embark on the vacation as planned, without regard for how I was doing. I felt abandoned and deceived when my mother left me alone in the hospital. After only one day alone, I couldn't stop crying. One of the nurses saw me crying. When she realized I didn't have anyone nearby to check on me, she offered to phone my mother. I told her it was all right, that they would probably not respond, but she insisted. So I gave her my father's number instead. I partly expected my father to chastise me or, like Kevin, tell me that I was exaggerating and that being alone in the hospital was no big issue. But when my father answered the phone and the nurse told him about my position, he was immediately alarmed. He sounded more concerned than I had heard Dad in a long time and inquired whether my mother had truly gone on the vacation without me. I described everything, including how Kevin insisted on leaving me behind because he didn't want the trip money to go to waste, and how my mother eventually consented. My father was outraged. As I told him everything, he became silent. But I could sense his rage simmering. He then told me that my mother had just indicated that we had been in a little fender bender, downplaying the entire incident. She hadn't mentioned my fractured arm, concussion, or the fact that she and Kevin had left me alone in the hospital. According to what she told him, there was nothing to worry about, therefore he didn't feel the need to contact me. Hearing that my mother had willfully lied about my circumstances to my father made me feel even more hurt and betrayed. My father instantly told me that he will come over as soon as possible. He said he'd drop everything, drive to the hospital, and remain with me for as long as it took. For the first time since my admission, I felt relieved. Knowing that my father was on his way to be with me and that someone was finally taking my condition seriously. As I sat there waiting, I realized how much I needed this type of support in my life. Within 2 hours, my father arrived at the hospital. Seeing him enter through the door felt like a great weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I started crying as he hugged me and promised me that everything will be fine. He then went straight to my doctors, making sure he grasped every aspect of my injuries. I could see relief on his face as he affirmed that, while my injuries were severe and significant, they were not life-threatening. He genuinely regretted not being there for me sooner and not challenging my mother's version of events. He told me he regretted assuming that everything was good without personally checking in on me, and it was evident he was beating himself up over it. My father was visibly angry at Kevin. He was upset that my stepfather had the audacity to dismiss my demands and then choose to go on a trip rather than ensure my well-being. Kevin's lack of respect and concern by leaving me alone in the hospital demonstrated how little I meant to him. His behavior screamed volumes, indicating that despite being married to my mother, I was nothing more than an annoyance to him. My father tried contacting my mother and Kevin, but neither answered. This infuriated Dad even more, and he vowed that he would give Kevin and Mom a lesson for abandoning me like this. Over the next 2 nights, my father stayed by my side, having taken time from work to ensure that I was not alone. He never left me alone till I was released. Even then, he wasn't keen about me returning to Kevin's place, where I'd be left with only a babysitter until everyone returned. Instead, he insisted I accompany him home, and I consented. Once I arrived at my father's house, he attempted to contact Mom again. She claimed to have missed his previous calls since she was having so much fun with Kevin and his sons. Hearing this inflamed his rage even more, and he did not hold back. He forcefully told her that her actions were unacceptable, that abandoning me in the hospital was a major act of neglect, and that he intended to take legal action to hold her and Kevin responsible. He even mentioned taking her to court if necessary, which implies she could lose custody of me. He made it apparent that he was ready to report her and Kevin for their activities. Since then, my phone has been constantly vibrating with calls and texts from both Kevin and my mother. Instead of accepting their actions or apologizing, they've been sending messages accusing me of ruining their vacation by informing my father about my position. Kevin has even gone so far as to claim that all I had to do was keep my mouth shut and silently remain in the hospital without causing a scene. They said everything would have been okay if I had just complied. I was made to feel bad about throwing my mom and stepdad under the bus. Update 1. For everyone who is asking, now that I've had some time to think about it and spoken with my father, I know how many times Kevin and Mom have neglected me over the years, and I've just let it happen. I remained silent, thinking things would change, but they never did. It's difficult to accept, yet I let myself be pushed aside for their convenience. Now, thinking back, I can't believe I put up with it for so long. For example, Kevin frequently strained my relationship with my father. He would continually make disparaging comments about him, calling him a deadbeat or a loser in comparison to him. Kevin believed my father was not a good spouse to my mother, and as a result, he felt he had the right to criticize him whenever he wanted. Mom never asked him to stop. When I experienced problems at home or tried to talk to my mother about them, Kevin always rejected my concerns. He would tell me that I was exaggerating things or that I was overly sensitive because I was a girl. He often said that this was why he was so fortunate to have only boys. Kevin consistently demonstrated preference for his sons, even in minor everyday exchanges. He was always willing to help them with their bills. But if I asked my mother for anything, Kevin would probe me with endless questions. He often accused me of buying useless items and wasting money, even though it wasn't his money. It was my father's money, therefore I should have had the freedom to spend it any way I chose. Despite living in the same house, we never had quality time together as a family. Kevin and Mom would frequently make plans with his sons and exclude me, claiming they didn't want to bother me or wanted to spend quality time together without me. This often made me feel abandoned and unimportant. They'd go out to dinner or do activities they enjoyed without thinking about whether I'd want to join. This is perhaps why I was so delighted to accompany them on their vacation. They rarely engage me in their plans. Kevin and Mom also do not like to celebrate my birthdays. They usually tell me that since Kevin's sons don't make a big fuss about their birthdays, I shouldn't expect much either. It's as if they assume I don't deserve particular attention simply because it's not their style. When it comes to gifts, I constantly wind up with stuff I don't like or utilize, as if they didn't think about what I genuinely appreciate. Whenever I was failing in school, Kevin would say stuff like, "You're just lazy, that's your problem. And why do you even bother with that stuff?" Instead of asking what was wrong or providing assistance, he complained about how it inconvenienced him. Mom, on the other hand, would remain mute, offering no words of comfort or support despite knowing how badly it affected me. Update 2. So, my father did report Mom and Kevin to CPS. He didn't make this decision lightly, but he felt it was vital to ensure that what had occurred was not forgotten. He couldn't just sit back and let them treat me that way, abandoning me in the hospital with no second thought. When Kevin and my mother came home, they were called by CPS. They had to answer numerous questions about the situation, their behavior, and their decision to leave me. I'm sure it was a wake-up call for them, one they probably didn't expect. But the authorities agreed with my father. Leaving me behind in the hospital, especially after being injured, was unacceptable. They admitted that I had been ignored in a way that jeopardized my well-being. Later, my mother called me. She wasn't happy, and her tone indicated that she was furious with me. She told me that by involving CPS, I had gotten both her and Kevin in a lot of trouble. She seemed to be blaming me for what had happened, although I knew I had done nothing wrong. She cautioned me that CPS would be contacting me next to hear my side of the story. My mother then forcefully pressured me to lie to the authorities, warning me that if I didn't, I'd be taken away from her and she'd lose custody. I disagreed with her, telling her that I wasn't comfortable lying to the authorities and that she should have considered the repercussions of her actions before abandoning me at the hospital that day. Mom then tried to guilt-trip me, telling me that she had given me years of her life and that I needed to prove my loyalty to her this time. She made it sound like I was betraying her by being open with the authorities, as if I was to blame for everything that transpired. But what really struck me was her statement that lying would protect Kevin and his sons. She emphasized how the CPS investigation could generate complications for Kevin, particularly with his ex-wife. She warned that Kevin's ex might find out and use this as leverage to make Kevin pay for it. I just shook my head, realizing that my mother was more worried with Kevin's reputation and her own than with what I had gone through. She never inquired about my health or recovery. Meanwhile, she begged me to lie and protect her family. I couldn't stand her selfishness any longer. I kept my position and told her unequivocally that I didn't care how this affected her or Kevin. I would not lie to the authorities. I informed her that I would tell them everything that happened and that I would not be covering up anything for anyone. If this meant she and Kevin were in trouble, then so be it. They were the adults here. They were the ones who made mistakes, so I was not going to shield them from the consequences of their actions. My mother raged at me, calling me names, but I refused to give in. Update 3. It has been about 2 weeks since my previous update. I spoke to the